Hello and welcome to the National Centre for Writing's Meet the World event on graphic novels from the Arab world. My name is Nadiyah Abdullatif, and I am a translator in residence with the National Centre for Writing as part of their Visible Communities programme. I've done some work on comics and graphic novels myself, including a co-translation of a Lebanese graphic novel called Yoghurt and Jam, or How My Mother Became Lebanese, by Lena Merhej. And that book is being published this year by Balestia Press. And I'm delighted to be joined today by a wonderful panel of three talented translators of recently published graphic novels. I'll invite them to each introduce themselves and tell us a little about their work on graphic novels and how they got into translating them. So perhaps we can start with Emma.
Sure. Hi, my name is Emma Ramadan, and these two books that I've been translating by Lamia Ziadé, My Port of Beirut and My Very Great Arab Melancholy, are actually my first two illustrated books. I don't think they quite qualify as graphic novels, but maybe they do. They're illustrated. It's text accompanied by illustrations, and I think I kind of came into this genre just because I was so taken with her writing, specifically with Lamia Ziadé's writing, and the way that she's able to pair these images, her own illustrations, with her text as a way to kind of bring her readers more deeply into the scenes that she's describing, and in many cases sort of be traumatic events and the urgency of what she's describing, and how those illustrations and sometimes they're recreations of newspaper articles and images from Instagram and things, how it really, I felt, made it a lot more alive in her telling. And so I brought myself into this genre for her books specifically.
That's lovely. Thank you, Emma. And definitely see what you mean about how the images bring the reader deeper into the text. Maybe Amy could go next.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Amy Chiniara. I work as a graphic designer and illustrator in Beirut. I'm not, I would never, I won't call myself a translator. So Rawand Issa's book is the first time I tried translating something from Arabic to English. It was a very big learning experience for me, since I guess it's a bit of an amateur thing at this point. And of course, I'd like to go into it more. And that's basically it.
I totally relate to everything you're saying there, Amy. The co-translation I did with Anam on Anam Zafar on Yoghurt and Jam was my first, pretty much first project, literary translation project. So yeah, I know exactly what you mean. And Deena.
Yes. Hi, I'm Deena Mohamed. I also don't consider myself a translator. I am a translator really by necessity, because I am a graphic novelist, but I primarily work in Arabic. And so in order to fund my Arabic work, I have to translate it and sell it in English. So I've been mainly, my experience in translation is all in self-translation. So I've been publishing my work in English and in Arabic for a long time. And I've had many different experiences in translating my work. Sometimes I will work in Arabic first, sometimes I'll work in English first. I think of myself usually as a bilingual comics artist one way or another. But specifically, I think today I'll probably be talking mainly about Shubik Lubik, which was my biggest official translation undertaking. It was originally my Arabic graphic novel trilogy. It was published in Egypt by Doro Mahrouso, and recently the English translation was published by Pantheon Books in English as a collected volume. So it's like a 520-page graphic novel, which is a very big graphic novel in English. And so that's definitely been my most recent both translation and publishing experience. And that's primarily what I'm known for, I think. So yes.
I just want to say, because I know a couple of you mentioned that you're not primarily translators. One of the aims of the Visible Communities program that I'm participating in as a translator in residence, and that this event is part of, is to diversify access routes to literary translation. I also have a very non-traditional background in terms of my route into translation, and I always wanted to be a translator, but I did something else completely for a few years, and it's very recently that I got into translation, and I'm finally kind of enjoying what I always kind of hoped I would do one day. And I think there's a lot of translators out there who are in the same boat and totally relate to all of this. So thank you all for being here with us today. I think the people watching will already realize that we're going to be discussing 4 or even 5 very different graphic novels. I think what I kind of thought we could maybe discuss today is kind of looking at the translation process, our personal connection to these works, and also identity, language, and representation. So the first, I think maybe we could start with process, image, and personal connection. So the process of translating a graphic novel can really differ from translating other genres. And while I was preparing for this event, I noticed that one really interesting thing about this panel is that between us, we cover a lot of different translation models. So co-translation with myself and Anam, and self-translation with Deena, and solo translation, but I imagine with a degree of collaboration with the author for Emma and Amy. So I'm gonna put my first question to Deena, because you've spoken a little bit about the experience of self-translation, and you did this really wonderful piece for Arablit about that. I know that you also have before Your Wish Is My Command, you had also written and illustrated, and I think also translated Kahira, your webcomic. So this is a few questions in one, but I'd love to hear a bit more about your experience, anything that you found particularly challenging when self-translating, and also how that experience differed once you started working with a publishing house.
Okay, that is a very big question. So let me try. You will have to stop me if I keep going on too long, because that's essentially my entire comics career. So I will try and keep it brief. I did start originally making comics with a webcomic, and actually that webcomic was originally in English because I was posting it online, and I was posting it on Tumblr for my English speaking internet friends. It just didn't occur to me to post it in Arabic, and the entire comic was conceptualized for English speaking readers. So even the content it discussed and the purpose of it was really not intended for Arabic speaking readers. I've talked a lot about the process of translating Ghadara because even the conceptualization of a Muslim Egyptian superhero, it really only subverts expectations if you have a sort of specific understanding of superheroes, and it's a very westernized understanding of it. It's not really as relevant to an Egyptian audience. I feel like Egyptian superheroes are usually between either corny or satirical, and I was more or less continuing in this tradition of satire. And so with Qahira, I did a couple of these online comics that were sort of social commentary. I was commenting about things I was encountering mainly online, so things relating to Islamophobia or misogyny, which probably isn't mainly online, but I was having the conversation in the online sphere. So as a response to other things I was seeing posted by other people. And then when I did the third comic, which was about sexual harassment, that comic was much more based in Egypt because that was my experience of sexual harassment. And at the time, I was kind of making these comics based on just whatever I was thinking about. And when I did the third comic, the sexual harassment comic, a few people asked me to translate it into Arabic. And so I translated it into Arabic, and it also kind of went viral in like the Egyptian internet sphere. So it was very popular on Facebook and so on at the time, which surprised me because I didn't think people would like it. But then I understood like what they liked about it specifically, like just that it was discussing a certain like issue, but also that it was discussing it in a way that they understood and they agreed with. And I sort of from there started to think about it in English and in Arabic. I made the strip much more Egyptian because I felt like I could. I just hadn't realized it was something I could do. And I think after that, it was sometimes I would think of a comic in English first. Sometimes I would think of it in Arabic first. But eventually that grew too tiresome for me. I was starting to think of the audience too much. I was starting to think of like who would be reading it too much. And it was also more difficult to address issues like with the knowledge that they were going to so many different areas, especially because it was quite consistently going viral. And I was 18, so I think 18, 19. So at the time I was learning a lot. And so one of the things I learned is that I really liked comics, and I did enjoy the learning process of a webcomic because it's conversational, but I also wanted to try working on a comic in Arabic. So because of Qahira, I ended up doing my undergraduate research on the history of Egyptian comics. And I got much more inspired by Arabic comics and Egyptian comics specifically. And I wanted to do something that was a little more spread out, that wouldn't be just a webcomic, that was in Arabic first for an Egyptian audience. I really wanted to see it just like in a bookstore. I was aiming for like a very specific Egyptian publishing experience. Even though I knew publishing Egyptian comics is not really actually successful. Like from my research, I know it's not possible to publish multiple graphic novels in Arabic. And so I was mainly just doing it because this was the kind of creation I was comfortable with. And it took me a few years to be able to get the book out because I was just working other jobs. So comics wasn't like my main focus. Until I took it to Cairo Comics. And so when I took it to Cairo Comics, I self-published it. It was in Arabic. And then it won the prize at Cairo Comics. And then after it won the prize, someone who had heard about Qahira previously, like an Egyptian-American professor, asked me if I would be interested in showing it to her agent. And so I translated the version that had won the prize at Cairo Comics. It was like around 80 pages. I translated the PDF. I sent it to the agent, and the agent was really excited about it, and she was happy to represent me. And so, but she told me basically, like, if you have plans for like more parts, it would be better if you want to get a bigger publisher to have a bigger book. And I was like, well, I've always had plans for part 2 and 3. I just didn't think I would actually do them like within the next 5-6 years. And so when we pitched it, we pitched all 3 books as one. And then I sold the English translation, and then the advance from the English translation let me stay at home to work on the Arabic versions because it's very difficult to just have the money to be a full-time comics artist. But if you live in Egypt and you're getting paid abroad, then it's much more doable. So for Shubik specifically, it was selling the English translation that helped me work on it in Arabic. But I was always thinking of it in Arabic first. So I had streamlined the issue I had with Qahira, and I said, okay, well, I will work on it in Arabic. I'll focus on the Arabic only. Once it's out in Arabic, then I'll start thinking about the translation, which is essentially what I did. I finished all 3 parts in Arabic, and then I sent them to my American publishers. And then I started process of translation. So I was deliberately trying not to work on it bilingually. I was working on it purely in Arabic. And then I was dealing with it. I was kind of like, as I was working on it, I knew I was making problems for myself, because I would be like, how am I going to translate this later? And then I would be like, this is a problem for future Deena. And then future Deena had a lot of issues. And that is the entire journey. I think I should stop now because it's getting already quite long. But that's essentially how I ended up translating Shabik Shabik.
That's super interesting, and I do feel like the work of a translator is endlessly about like problems and translation dilemmas, and it's really interesting that you know, like sometimes I think as a translator you're like frustrated with your author, like, oh, why did they have to do something that's so difficult for me to translate? And did you have a bit of like frustration with yourself at times?
Oh yes, no, I actually knew, like, as I was writing it, because I was writing it specifically for an Egyptian audience, and I was choosing things that I knew really wouldn't translate. Like, I when I was writing them, I was like, this is never going to translate. And to an extent, I was right. But I think it was worth it, because what wasn't translatable is still what made the novel good. And so even communicating that much in the English version still makes it better than it would have been if it had just been kind of like a sort of not wishy-washy novel, but if it had been less based in its setting. Because it is a fantasy novel, but part of the realism is what makes it work. And so for me, at least, I also had the advantage of being the author. So whenever I faced a translation issue, or for example, if I had feedback that something wasn't clear because it's too culturally Egyptian, or it's something that the editors don't understand, I would just add pages. And I remember, because I asked a lot of translators at the time that I knew, because I knew people, you know, from Arab Lit, and I knew a lot of professional translators, and I would say, is this right? Like, am I allowed to do this? And they would say, you are allowed to do it because you're the author. But if someone else was translating for you, they wouldn't be allowed to do that. And so it really only works because I was self-translating. And so it's kind of a double-edged sword. So the English edition ends up being like expanded because of so many things that they would give me a comment of like, we don't understand this. So I would just add like 4 pages. But that was on me. Like, I didn't need to do it. I just felt like I had the time and I wanted to. There were some things that I also, I don't know if we're really going to get into process right now, because I felt like that was maybe for the second half. But essentially, I approached it sort of the way I like reading translated things. So like the way I read, like, for example, manga that's translated by fans, or, you know, things that are subtitled by fans, like unofficial translations. I tend to enjoy those more than professional translations, because I can see the translator's hand in it, and it feels like a translation. And so to me, the only thing that really made this book work was if it felt like a translation. I really was scared, not scared, but I had this feeling that if it came off as like an Egyptian American novel, it would lose so much of what it is. So I wanted people to know that it was translated. And so, for example, I got to keep it from right to left, which was like kind of a big deal to me, at least, because it was something I hadn't been thinking about while I was working on it. So as I was working, I thought eventually I would have to flip it, because I had been doing that with Qagero. And then when I asked Pantheon, like, can I just keep it right to left? And they were like, yeah. And I was like, oh. So that alone made a huge difference, because it really contextualized the novel. And then I treated it like sort of just like a translation. I was able to adapt the role of the narrator. So in Arabic, the narrator is a tour guide for the magic system of the world. And in English, the narrator is a tour guide for the magic system and also a tour guide for Egypt. So the narrator is also a translator. And again, this is something that another translator wouldn't have been able to do. It's something I was able to do because I'm the author, and so I can be like, well, the narrator says something different now, and it's fine. But I realized how evil it was, because when now it's being translated into French and Italian, and the French and Italian translators can both read English and Arabic, and they know both versions are different. And so they come back to me and they're like, which one do we use for the translation? And I'll be like, honestly, I don't know. Like, they are almost two slightly different books in a way. The story is unchanged, but there is a significant difference. And so I don't envy the third language through job at all. But yeah, that was kind of the process for me, at least.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear how kind of non-linear it was as well. And definitely some of those things are things I was definitely going to ask about later on. And I think we will. I definitely want to come back to things like the right to left direction. But I also just want to kind of go to Emma and Amy and just ask, like, how would you say Deena's experience compared with your own, and like your own like collaboration with the author? And maybe starting with Amy, I understand that you're quite close friends with the author, Rawand Issa. So I'm interested to hear how that affected your collaboration, but also like because you're also based in Lebanon, so I'm kind of wondering about your own personal connection to the story as well.
The time that we started translating was around like May, June 2021. So it was quite a while ago. And a lot has changed since then. But at the time, we were still sort of in the COVID time. It was the full-on economic collapse. It was still not so long after the port explosion. So there was so much chaos around how we sort of got into doing this project together. Like, we were mostly, okay, there was chaos, but we were stuck at home. So of course it helped so much that it was a very easy process to do in terms of like, I would text her, send her a WhatsApp voice note. What do you need here? How exactly do you think okay, there's this word, maybe it won't work so much. Maybe it's too heavy in English. Maybe it's too, it doesn't have the same weight that it would have in Arabic. So it was really a lot of back and forth, and it just makes it so much easier when you know the person that you're working with, especially when it's not your field. So I think that sort of, and because the story for me is something that, like, okay, Rawand and I have a very different background, I guess, and our upbringing in Lebanon is quite different. But this issue, this story of hers about like privatization, the loss of public life and a public space, is so common, and it's so ongoing all the time. Like, the issue of the beaches being privatized is something that started gradually happening during the civil war in Lebanon, because there was all of this it was very laissez-faire, everyone was doing whatever they wanted to do. Buildings were being built completely randomly. Resorts were coming up in areas that were previously just beaches. And after the war ended and like the economic boom of the 90s continued, this thing just sort of spiraled out of control. Like, most of our public beaches are now closed off, and there are still campaigns happening now in areas that have always been like public spaces, and people are like building villas, building resorts, and like privatizing, even though there are actually laws against this, but of course they're not applied. So like, the story is really just, it hits on all of these levels, about all of these things, and about the themes of immigration, which is something that is so prevalent in Lebanese society, and especially in the last few years, where everyone's like, okay, we need to leave, better life and all of that. But it's very difficult to completely detach yourself. And I think the way she talks about it is so on point, not because she's my friend, because I actually do think it's a very on point way of, like, it just hits the all of these themes, and it sort of like brings them together. And that's the thing I was hoping to do with, like, in the English translation. I wanted to make Rawand talks about these themes accessible, and they are themes that are universal, but I was hoping the English version would also make that more relatable, I guess, to a wider audience.
Yeah, that's so interesting to hear about. And yeah, I definitely noticed these like very strong themes of loss of public space, of even like a way of life. I actually read your translation and Emma's translation of My Port of Beirut in very close succession. And from both of them, I just got this really overwhelming feeling of loss. So with Emma's translation, more loss of life, loss of limbs, loss of buildings, loss of hope to some extent, although I think it ends on like a slightly more optimistic note. Just going back to the sort of the original question, because I'm digressing a bit, but how I think you're already working on another translation for Lamia Ziadé, right? And yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear about your work, kind of as a solo translator, and to what extent you had input from her as well.
Yeah. So my first translation was My Port of Beirut, which just came out from Pluto Press, I think like a few weeks ago. I don't have finished copies yet, but it's out there somewhere. And I kind of approached this translation from maybe a very different, it sounds like I have a different, journey with translation than you all. I've been translating for about 10 years, but I think I saw translation as this intellectual literary exercise, and it's only in the last maybe 3-4 years, maybe even less than that I've started to see translation as something really for yourself or for myself, and it's something to get to know myself better or to access different parts of myself. And I'm half Lebanese, but my dad left during the Civil War and never went back, didn't teach me Arabic, didn't talk to me about Lebanon, never wanted me to go, had sort of really separated himself. And I felt like this imposter and somebody who claimed to be half Lebanese but knew very little about Lebanon. And I became sort of obsessed with this idea of translating as a way to get to know Lebanon better. And I translate from French. I don't speak Arabic yet. I'm working on that, but it's sort of the kinds of books that I'm really interested in seem to be written mainly in Arabic or English. And to find a Lebanese writer writing in French who was doing something I was really interested in, when that happened with Lamia Ziadé's books, it felt like this really urgent thing that I had to do. And her books she lives in Paris, and we talked briefly over the phone once, and over WhatsApp messaging a little bit, just so that she could get to know why I was even interested in her books. And then when I translated My Port of Beirut, she read over the translation, and I think her English is quite good, but not maybe at the level where we were, collaborating. Really, it was mainly she was just reading over my translation, and if I had sort of missed something here or there or some kind of reference that I didn't grasp, she was pointing that out, which was really helpful. And I just finished a draft of My Great Arab Melancholy, which a very different kind of book. It's much more expansive. My Port of Beirut is about the port explosion and also about her family history growing up in Lebanon during the Civil War, and kind of comparing those two events and the trauma of the two events to give a sense of the scale and scope. But My Great Arab Melancholy sort of is an expansive look at the wider Arab world and the major events she sees as kind of being pivotal moments in that area, in that region. And so I just finished a draft of that, and she looked it over and gave me some feedback, and we're still sort of in the editing process there. So it hasn't been, a totally collaborative effort, though she's been a vital resource for me. But surprisingly, there's been this other translation partner that has emerged, which is my father, which has been a kind of a really special experience because, again, like I said, he's had this sort of block with me about Lebanon, and in translating these books, I've been going to him frequently to say, can you talk to me more about this thing? Because I can, Google it, but I'd rather hear about it from you. Or some of the illustrations have Arabic text in them that I can't read, but I have to translate for the captions. And so going to my father and saying, help me translate this Arabic text. And it's been sort of this really lovely and surprising way of us connecting over that together, that I'm about to go visit him in a few weeks, and I want to bring him the book and talk to him more about it. But that's been kind of a lovely alternate form of, I wouldn't call it co-translation, but some kind of collaboration that has been born out of these books, in addition to the author's help.
That's such a lovely story. And again, I'm relating to so many things that you're saying, because I would say that for me as well, translation is like kind of a journey of self-discovery. Not so much with the kind of translations from Arabic, because I'm not Arab, although people often think I am. I'm told I have a very Arab name, but I'm actually Mauritian. I was born in Mauritius, and to be very specific, Indo-Mauritian. So my ancestors are from India, and my translation of like my work on Mauritian literature is kind of primarily what I've been doing with the National Centre for Writing. And I call my dad all the time when I'm working, because there's so much that I grew up in the UK. I feel like I missed out on so much. So I feel like I'm always like, oh, can you explain this historical thing to me, or this cultural thing to me, or this word that I don't really hear people using anymore nowadays? So I feel like I'm relating to a lot of that. And when it comes to like Arabic and graphic novels, I love Arabic. I love languages, and I love graphic novels. So I think that's kind of how I came to all of that myself. And my experience was a co-translation with Anam Zafar, who was just such a brilliant person to work with. And we had this really, I felt like co-translation, or even, I imagine that Amy and Emma, you must have kind of had this experience as well. I felt like together we kind of brainstormed a lot. So there were a lot of like, our creativity just kind of, we just bounced a lot of ideas off each other. And that was so wonderful. And then we also had the author Lena Merhej like looking over our translation, giving input, and telling us when there was maybe like you said, Emma, something that we may have missed. So yeah, I mean, there's always an extent to which I feel you try to bring in the author as much as possible, right? Okay, so the next thing, and I think you kind of spoke a little bit about this, Emma, was kind of how, so you mentioned a bit about how the illustrations work in My Port of Beirut, and how that's a little different from other graphic novels. And one thing that I noticed was that all of these graphic novels have like a very different style. And when I was working on Yoghurt and Jam, I attended this workshop led by another translator. Her name's Sarah Ardizoni, and she's translated loads of graphic novels. And she talked quite a lot about, how you take the images, the illustrations into account, like the style, the color palette, and things like that, and how that can inform your translation. So I kind of wanted to ask a question to Amy on this, because I found that Inside the Giant Fish had this very like distinctive style and very distinctive colors. So it's like this bright color palette of pinks, blues, reds, especially for the bits in Lebanon, and I think like more grays for like the bits in Canada. And then also there's this like playful, defiant feel, the way that everything is drawn. Like there's a lot of rolled eyes, pulling faces, hairy legs, and like things like that. I really loved those details. And I just wondered, I mean, did that influence like your wording choice or tone or anything like that at times?
Well, the thing is, like I told you, unfortunately, I didn't have the full layout in Arabic to work with. I was working from the Word document. I am very familiar with Rawand's work and the way she writes and the way she draws. So it's not like I wasn't seeing anything at all. Like I knew more or less how it was going to look. And it was more for me about matching the way that she talks. And the thing is, there would be sometimes that there would be these Lebanese colloquialisms, if you want, that would play in, and that would be like, how do we make that in English? How does that work in English? It's gonna sound so weird. It was more the focus on that than so much the style, because like I already said, her style, the way she writes is so direct and so like on point. So I just wanted to make sure that that was the primary thing I was getting. And because there isn't a lot of dialogue, it's mostly VO or the narrator talking. It was more the focus on that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And because you mentioned it, one question I had for all of you, very quick question, is just on kind of format in terms of like, so when Anam and I were looking into, well, how do you translate a graphic novel? Because usually like I've definitely like worked with prose before, so you're just using a Word document, right? And some, I think we had some recommendations where some translators used a Word document with a numbering system where all of the illustrations and captions and all the little speech bubbles, they were all numbered. And we actually did something quite different. So we used like text boxes over the original in the PDF. And it was a bit fiddly, but the advantage of that was that we always had the text alongside the image. We knew how much space we had in each box, so we knew what was going to be too long or too short. But yeah, I'd be really curious to hear like if anyone has any other tips or tricks for, you know, how they went about that.
I can talk about this because I actually think this is the correct approach. You do have to, if you're doing it from a script, you have to bear in mind that it is going to take up space on a page. And so sometimes you might just be limited by literally the space you have in the bubble. Like it is partly that thing you do when you're writing comics as well, as making sure you have the space in the drawing to put it in the text. And so once you're translating, that's a secondary aspect of it. It is a visual translation at the end of the day. And honestly, for me, again, I had added benefit of like, I'm also doing the layouts. I'm delivering the final PDF. I'm doing the lettering. So, I mean, actually in English, it's much easier to edit because in English, I use a font. In Arabic, I was handwriting everything. And so I will say I did sometimes just make the speech bubbles bigger or smaller as I needed to. But I wonder for like you guys who might not necessarily be in charge of the final PDF, how that worked. Because I mean, especially for Amy, because you didn't even have the layout. But I also know Rawand leaves like a lot of space for her text. So I think it probably just worked out very luckily in that sense.
I think it did. Yeah, I tried to match the word count, to be very honest. Like I tried to be as the not exact same number of words, but at least as close to the sentence as possible, like to see it. And also knowing that it was going to be a font meant that, you know, it gives a bit of, like, it's not lettering and everything gets messed up, you know, you're making someone repeat a ton of work. It was like knowing that there's the ability to resize. And like you said, she does have areas where it's okay, you know, if you need an extra, let's say 5 millimeters or something, it's doable. But it was really just trying to match the word count. And the thing that makes it easier is that, I mean, you were translating like 500 pages. This is a short graphic novel, and the word count completely as a Word document was short enough for me not to feel as intimidated as, honestly, the type of work is intimidating as someone who's not a professional. So like when I saw the final word count, she told me how many pages the graphic novel was, and then I was like, oh wow, okay, I don't know. And then I saw the final word count. I was like, okay, I think as a first attempt, this is feasible. Alhamdulillah.
And it was definitely successful and a wonderful read. So, you know, like,
thank you.
I really enjoyed it.
I've only read it in Arabic, so I'm really excited to read the English version.
Let me know what you think.
I've only read the English, and later on, I wanted to ask you a question about languages, but I just wanted to see if Emma wanted to say anything on that.
Oh, I had it so easy compared to all of you because Lamia's book, it's mainly text, and then the images, her illustrations typically will be on their own page, or they'll be like in the middle of the text. But my translation of the captions or of the text itself wasn't really affected by the spacing of the images. I was sort of like screenshotting and then putting them into my document, so I knew what the captions were going with. But I had it very easy. If anything, her illustrations were helping me with my translation, because then I had in front of me what she was describing, and I knew what words to use. And so, it didn't feel like a constraint. It felt more like an aid.
One thing that I wanted to ask, because you said, so you say that you had that part very easy, but one thing I did want to ask is, when I was reading my Port of Beirut, I found that it was a very difficult read, not because, it was translated in wonderful flowing English, but it was such a harrowing read. And I found that I was like, almost every page having to like take a deep breath and recompose myself before turning the page. And, even the text was very graphic, the descriptions of the damage and the injuries. And I just want to, I can only imagine that all of that must be magnified when you are translating and rereading those same passages. So what was your experience of that?
Yeah, it's really complicated, because I think I was very aware as I was reading it, or as I reading and translating it, that this was not my trauma. This is a lot of other people's trauma, and my job is to kind of convey that as urgently and as vividly and, descriptively as the author did. And so it was really heavy to translate. And I did find myself, I have a full-time job, so I was often translating it at night by myself in this dark room, and I would kind of emerge and be in this big bunk, and then have to actually realize, like, oh, it's because of this, and because I'm sitting with this violence and this death and this frustration of how avoidable this tragedy should have been, could have been, and that it was impacting me in this way to be translating and to be so close to it all the time. But then also feeling this, like I said, this imposter syndrome of this is my father's country, but not his, this tragedy is not his tragedy. The Civil War was his tragedy, but what I'm translating is not his tragedy. It's not my tragedy. And so how to kind of absorb that and sit with it without taking it on. I don't know if anything I'm saying makes sense, but because it's not my tragedy, I think I'm able to have the somewhat step back in order to translate it in the way that I needed to translate it. But yeah, of course, it's not easy to translate something like this and to have those illustrations there that are depicting the victims' faces. For most of my Port of Beirut, the illustrations are victims. So it's hard to sit with, and also I think it takes somebody maybe who's it's not my tragedy to be able to have enough removed to translate it. I don't know if that makes sense, but complicated.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think in Yoghurt and Jam, war and conflicts and crops up a lot. And yeah, I feel like some of what you're saying is also like, I definitely had those thoughts of, well, I didn't go through this. But yeah, like sometimes that can help when you're translating.
And I do think in the case of graphic novels about heavy, violent tragedies, the author wants you to feel the things that they're portraying, right? Otherwise they wouldn't put it on the page, and the illustrations are also meant to help you feel that. And so I think there's like a graphic novels and illustrated memoirs and all of these genre are meant to bring you in and meant to impact you in this like very urgent way, even if it's not your tragedy, especially if it's not your tragedy, right? It's supposed to make that tragedy alive for everyone. Yeah,
absolutely. I'm wondering if we now come on to, because I can see the time ticking away, sadly, but I'm wondering if we now come on to the second kind of set of themes that I had thought about, which are identity, language, and representation. So I mentioned a little bit about the Visible Communities program and its aims, and alongside sort of diversifying access routes to literary translation, it also aims to contribute to the debate around decolonizing literary translation and to expand the range of literature published in translation. So I suggested this topic because Arabic, Arab culture, and graphic novels are underrepresented in literary translation. And despite that, I feel that there's this very vibrant Arab graphic novel, comics, satire, webcomics scene, and there's so much there that needs to be translated. And I really wanted to spend some time focusing on these aspects. So my first question is kind of, well, it's more, I thought we could maybe reflect on source language and dialects and multilingualism, because I feel like we kind of all encountered those to a degree in the graphic novels that we were working on. Emma, you were translating from French, but some of the images included Arabic, and you did retain some Arabic words. And I noticed, Deena, you used like chevrons for the bits in that were said in English in Arabic, and you retained that. And that was something that I really liked, and I think it fits in with what you said earlier about like almost a reminder that this is a translation. What you were reading was like the majority of this was in Arabic. And so that was really interesting. I'll go to Emma first. Is there anything that you want to say about that, or like your rationale, or, you know, how you approached all of that?
Yeah, so I think the words that were left in Arabic was where the author had put the Arabic text in her French text. And so she was sort of, situating Arabic in her French text in a way that felt really intentional. So I wanted to make sure I did the same. And then, yeah, as I said, with the images, calling in the help of a native Arabic speaker became necessary for me in translating those parts.
Interesting. And Amy, I didn't read the original Arabic of the text that you translated. I'm just wondering, was it written in dialect? Was it written in standard Arabic?
It was standard Arabic, but there were here and there things that you'd be like, oh, this is very Lebanese. And the thing is, like Emma was saying, that she doesn't speak Arabic. For the better part of my life, like my Arabic has been extremely weak for someone who lived and grew up in Lebanon. So for me, it's also like I was educated at an English language school. I have a very foreign name for the place I live in. Also for me, it's been part of the process of sort of improving my Arabic. It's come a long way in the last 10 years for sure, but it's also a part of that. Like you asked about like identity and culture and all of these things at the beginning of your question, and very interesting because, like I told you, and then I have different backgrounds and different experiences of growing up in Lebanon. She grew up by the beach. I grew up mountain. She grew up in primarily Arabic-speaking area. I grew up in Franco-English environment. So like it does play into at least how I was viewing the translation and how the process was going. Because I was like, okay, I have these terminologies maybe in English, but I've never thought about their equivalent in Arabic. So it was like, this is part of the learning curve for me, I guess.
Yeah, very, very interesting. You mentioning this kind of mixture of languages in Lebanon and in Beirut is really interesting, because this is something that kind of cropped up a lot for Anam and I with when we were translating Yoghurt and Jam. There was this mixture of Arabic, French, English, German. And some of that would be, like it was originally written for a Lebanese audience. So some of that, having that mixture is not necessarily like a problem. It's a lot of those, a lot of that would have been really easily understood. And when we were translating, we had to really think hard about what to keep and also how to keep it. So, we made this decision to not use italics at all. And just let all of the languages kind of sit alongside each other on like an equal standing. And yeah, like it's really interesting to hear you talk about, your experience of growing up with all these different languages as well. Deena, do you want to say anything on that, on the language aspect?
And probably there is a lot to say. I mean, for me, actually, the English flattened out a lot of the language that was in the Arabic, because the Arabic actually has many dialects of Egyptian Arabic, some of which I don't speak. So I actually had to hire not really a translator, I guess, but a friend who does speak Upper Egyptian dialect. And I kind of would write the story with him. So I would tell him, if this character wants to say this, how would they say it in your dialect? And he would be like, well, they'd say this or that. And you would correct me, because I know how they speak, but I would never be able to accurately write it, especially because it varies from region to region. And so I wanted this sort of accurate representation. So I actually did have already, in the Arabic itself, I did have a kind of translation process and a kind of a process of writing about identities that are not my own. It's actually the number one question I get in the Arabic version. Is from like Egyptian readers and other Arabic speaking readers. They'll say like, how did you capture this? Because they look at me and they know this is not my background. And so they'll be like, how did you write that? And so I just asked, like I did research, I had help. I mean, it's to me as well, it's not too complicated. But for the English, all of that is kind of lost, because essentially all you get is an asterisk that says this character is speaking in an Upper Egyptian dialect. And so I was saying, like, part of the frustration of translating it into English is that you do have characters who are already speaking like a mix of English and Arabic. And that already says so much about that character. Just from reading it in Arabic, you already know what kind of character they are, what kind of education they have, what kind of background they have. And so again, in English, you just have to make do with the fact that this will be lost. Like there is no way really to keep that the same as it is. But it's the process of translation. It is what it is. And so I think again, I really just had to make use of the narrator to sort of explain who these characters are. I made use of like extra pages and things like that. But yes, I do think there was already like translation involved in writing it in Arabic, but a lot of people might not have realized.
That's really, really interesting. Almost in the way that like a translator researches how to translate a specific dialect, or you were researching how to write in that, and yeah, that's super interesting. So linked to that, I kind of want to ask, I mean, it's one big question or two big questions to all of you. I'm not very good at asking just one question. But I guess did anything big change in translation, or did anything big not change in translation? So Deena, you already mentioned this, keeping the right to left direction, and just for people watching who don't have the book, I have it here. And when you open, I guess what would naturally for an English speaker be the back of the book, it says, "This book was once in Arabic, so it is read from right to left. You are now at the beginning." And then if you turn to where, maybe many would naturally turn to, "This book was once in Arabic, so it is read from right to left. You are now at the end." So that was one big thing that changed. And I know for Anam and I, we actually kind of did the opposite of that, and we changed the order, and we even had to horizontally flip some of the images. And even then you have to be really careful, because sometimes if you horizontally flip an image of a place, it's all suddenly geographically wrong, and so it doesn't always work. But yeah, was there anything else? And this is for anyone to jump in.
I mean, the UK version you have is a different title, so there is that we should probably mention, because the US version kept the same title in Arabic, just transliterated, so it was Shukbik Lubik in English. But the UK version, they changed it to Your Wish Is My Command. It's pretty much the only difference between them is the cover. But that was, I think, a pretty significant difference to me. But no, other than that, that's all I have. Anyone else would like to take?
For Rawand's book, I think maybe the format changed. I'm not 100% sure, but I think there was a slight difference in format, maybe from the original Arabic book to the English. I think it's about publishing standards and stuff, but also, like I said already, we have the advantage that it's a short book, so the workload for flipping, rearranging, it makes it easier, especially if you want, if you're not going to keep the original orientation of the book, the workload is reduced. So I think it was mostly following what Mamoul might have asked her to do in terms of changing and stuff.
I do have a question about Rawand's book. What was the decision-making process behind translating the title inside the giant fish instead of inside the whale?
I actually we talked about that several times. Inside the belly of the whale, which would be the exact, very literal biblical translation. It just sounds heavy in English, to be very honest. Inside the giant fish is nice, and it kind of matches her drawing style. It's more whimsical, to the point. It's more whimsical. It gives you a different kind of imagery, because otherwise you're literally going to be thinking of the biblical story, which she does talk about in the book, but that's not necessarily the point she's trying to make with the book. It's not just about that, or the shrine of what's his name, John? Oh my god, I forgot. I got all the biblical characters mixed up.
Yeah.
Inside the giant fish, it is more whimsical. It's more it lets your imagination kind of go. What kind of fish is it? What kind of who is inside? What's going on? So it was more about that. It was alright in that, actually.
I liked it because I was surprised, because I thought it would just be called Inside the Whale or something. So I was like, oh, it's just unexpected.
Yeah, no, I think it works really well. It's a bit intriguing as well.
It is, and it's more fun to say. Sorry, go ahead.
Emma, did you have anything to add to that?
Most of the books, both of them stayed pretty much the same. I think she had written them already to be pretty accessible. She wants people to kind of have this into the Arab world that they might not have through a history book or something like that. So mostly the same. The one thing that changed was that we put in more footnotes. I think in both, she already had footnotes in her French text, so it didn't feel like this violation of the literary project to put in a few more. But there were some debates we had, me and the editor at the publishing house, about what actually really needs to be explained and what doesn't need to be explained. And, the average French reader probably knows more about Lebanon than the average American reader. Maybe that's not true. I don't know. But so we added in some more historical context and that kind of thing.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. And this is kind of one question I really wanted to ask you when it comes to representation, because I know that both of the graphic novels that you're translating for Lamia Ziadé are they received Pen Translates Awards, which is so did Yoghurt and Jam. And I just kind of wanted to ask you a bit about, I don't know to what extent you noticed, any differences like pitching a graphic novel and one from the Arab world, like sorry, this is a very unstructured question, but I know that like Pen Translates has these aims of promoting bibliodiversity, and I know that it has offered such valuable support for me, for Anam, for getting this work out there. And I just wanted to hear a bit about how that has supported you as well.
Yeah, so full disclosure, I already had the publisher Pluto when Pluto applied for the Pen Translates grants on my behalf. And so that, I would say, I was in a very fortunate position. But pre-Pluto coming around, I did have an experience that maybe some of you also had, which was even though Arab writers are so underrepresented in translation in the United States, it's become this thing where publishers would read my pitch and say, oh, this sounds great, but we already have something by an Arab writer coming out next year, as if they're all the same and as if like checking one box means you're doing the Lord's work. But, I got the response a few times of, well, we actually have this Iranian woman's book coming out next year and they're too similar. And of course they were nothing alike, but I think publishers are still in that mindset. And so I was very grateful to Pluto for, being better than that, and for doing such a wonderful job taking care of these books and making sure that they kind of reached people and that they were applying for funding. And I did get NEA funding in the US, which means that I'll be able to go to Lebanon this year, and I'll be able to take some Arabic lessons with that funding. And so that has felt like a very powerful kind of source of funding to have alongside these books, in addition to the Pen funding.
That's so exciting. Who did you say that's from?
Oh, for the National Endowment of the Arts.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Oh, brilliant. It's interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, I haven't done much pitching, so I had I think both Anam and I were like, we almost fell off our chairs actually, because the first publisher that we pitched to responded to us very quickly saying yes, they want it, and this is Balestia Press, and I think it is actually their first translation from Arabic. So I think we just had this like, I think we had heard so much about how difficult it can be, and we were just really pleasantly surprised. So I was really curious to hear from a more experienced I wanted to hear from a more experienced literary translator what your experience had been with that. Great. I feel like we're kind of running over a little bit. But I've just really been enjoying chatting to you all. And I guess before we close this discussion, I wanted to see firstly whether you have any questions for each other or any final, like, I don't know, key takeaways or like bits of advice for translators or anything like that.
I mean, I feel like I'm not really a translator in this sense, so I don't really know what I would even begin to ask people. I'm usually just asking them to read the English version and then the Arabic version and tell me if I did a good job. So I think that's been my experience insofar. I've had like 3 months of official translated experience. But I do have a newfound appreciation for how difficult translating is, because I do feel like I am constantly translating myself, but it is quite different to translate yourself in print, I think, or to be a translator in print. I think it's a very different experience, and so I find it interesting to think of as a career. I think it's really very, very transformative. But yeah, I don't know if I necessarily have questions. I just really wanted to know about the title for the Chinese dish.
Now you know. No, and I've like personally, I feel like, I mean, we're in a country like Lebanon, especially where, you know, they like to pride themselves on trilingualism in a lot of areas, and like, oh, we speak Arabic, English, and French. If someone has like, you know, let's say Russian mother or any other nationality, Austrian, whatever, that's an added language. Spanish, like you'll find people who speak 5-6 languages, but I think the actual practical application of it when it comes to translating is so different.
Yeah.
At some point, especially like when people like foreigners or something would be like, oh, you're Lebanese, you speak 3 languages, that's amazing. I'm like, no, we speak 3 languages badly. Like there's so much to learn about how like we relate to these languages, especially as someone who mixes them so randomly all the time. It's very difficult to stick to one. So sit and apply yourself and reading about like your relationship to each of these languages, especially since English is my first language. French is something I didn't learn formally, but I learned it from speaking with like my aunt, even though I didn't go to a French school. Arabic was left, you know, alone in the corner to cry. So like I really feel like this process of translation into question what it means to speak these 3 languages and how like the best way maybe to approach it is, and it's learning, it's pure learning. There's learn. Oh my god.
Do you think that you will both continue with translation in the future?
I mean, I have to, because I still haven't figured out how to get paid in Arabic. There is no money in making comics in Arabic only, unfortunately.
Definitely.
I mean, I'm trying to think of it as an advantage, because I do think even if I didn't have to rely on publishing in English to publish in Arabic, I would have still been happy to publish in English. But I do think it's a lot more loaded than it is otherwise. And I do realize, like, I think the difficulty for me is that I want to see Arabic comics prosper, but I also haven't figured out how to do it yet, because even if Shubik Lubik is a relatively successful Arabic publishing experience and it's selling out or selling well, it's still not enough to be able to publish in Arabic. Like, Arabic comics artists still have to rely on grants. They still have to rely on translation.
Or they rely on sorry, I'm cutting you off. No, I also feel like what you're saying is like, even the ones that are reading in Arabic, a lot of them are from the diaspora. They're the ones that maybe have a bigger interest, at least in Lebanon. For me, Egypt, that's my experience with Lebanon.
In Egypt, not necessarily. In Egypt, the readership is pretty diverse. And actually, I mean, Egyptians aren't really the main purchasers of Shubik Lubik. Like, really, it's selling in like Saudi or like in other Arab countries. So just as an Arabic speaking market, it's there. It's just still not enough to sustain the amount of work that making a graphic novel needs.
Yeah.
So, like, no matter how I look at it, you know, translation to me, it's not really a matter of communication or a matter of you know, adaptation. Even, like, it's not something I do because I'm thinking of how to send it to different people. Like with Qalvera, I was translating because I was looking to communicate with different people, right? So I wanted to share with my English-speaking friends, with my diaspora friends specifically. So with Qalvera, it was very much like a diaspora experience sort of thing for me, who's not in diaspora. But with Shubik, it's not. It's just a matter of I don't know how else to make comics currently, and I'm also very lucky to even have an agent, to even have access to big American publishers, to even be in multiple comics markets at once. So it is a privilege, but it's kind of not double-edged, but it's a necessity also. Yani it's not really, one would not exist without the other. So I haven't really figured out how the future of comics is going to look like, but I do know in order for me to work in Egypt, I need to be translating myself constantly. And this is true of most jobs in Egypt now anyway. So I don't know. I mean, I do know what that says. But I don't think we have the time to get into it. So
it is super interesting though, because I feel like there are parallels with, like, you know, a lot of literary translators find that, you know, translating literature is a labor of love. That's what they always call it, because we can't get paid enough to get it. For that, you know, I do a lot of commercial work alongside my literary translation. It is the only way I can do any literary translation, because again, like, kind of as you say, the time required, the time it demands, isn't always, you don't always see that reflected in, you know, financially. Emma, is there anything that you wanted to say?
Just like as a last note, advice to translators sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, I think as I sort of mentioned earlier, I spent a lot of time thinking that translation was supposed to be an invisible, seamless, selfless act, and I'm really happy I don't see it that way anymore. And that I think I've never felt so excited about translation as when I'm translating something that feels like it's a selfish act in addition to being in service of the author, that it can also bring me closer to something in myself. And I think it's as you said, because it can feel like a labor of love, and we don't feel like we get fair wages here, especially I think in the UK it might be ever so slightly better, but in both the UK and the US, I think it's not a sustainable profession unless you find the thing that makes you really love it and really excited about doing it. So I think making that shift for me has been really important.
Yeah, I think that is definitely what I'm finding as well. Okay, well, thank you all so much. I think we are well over time now, but I just wanted to ask, can you just really briefly each say where we can buy your book or your translation? Maybe we can start with Deena.
Yes, Shubik is available in America and North America as Shubik. I think it's like on Amazon, Penguin Random House, all of their websites. And in the UK, it's available as Your Wish Is My Command. Also, all the mainstream book, or I don't know because I don't buy it there. In Egypt, it's available from Diwan, and the Arabic versions are also available from Diwan, and also all the other bookstores. So available where books are sold.
Emma?
Yeah, so my Port of Beirut Pluto Press just published in the UK. I think eventually it will be distributed in the US, but for the UK purposes, I think it should be also available where books are sold, hopefully in all the independent bookstores. And my great Arab Melancholy will be out in 2024.
Brilliant. Is that also with Pluto Press?
Yeah, also with Pluto.
And Amy?
So far as in the US, I'm not sure if I think they do international shipping, but I'm not 100% sure.
They do. And Dharma also goes all over the
ships
Arab
international.
Yes. It's also available like in many Arabic speaking outlets, because Mahrousa goes around. So that they're available in several areas.
And that was Mahmoud Press in the US, right?
In English, yeah.
English. Yeah.
You can also get shubik in Arabic from Mamul Press in North America. I forgot.
Oh, that's great to know as well.
They're very, very helpful. And
Yeah.
then Renta in the UK. I also forgot to mention UK publishers.
Right.
And what about Yogurt and Jam?
So that is not yet published at the time of recording, but hopefully published by the time this goes out. So that's being published by Balestia Press, and I hope it will also be sold everywhere where books are sold. So yeah. Yeah, we'll see. Where exactly in due course. Hopefully, by the time this goes out, we'll be able to add a little bit more information on that. But thank you all so much. I have really loved chatting to all of you and getting to meet all of you. And I want to also say thank you to everyone who's watching, and thank you to the National Centre for Writing for supporting our work and hosting us today. The other Meet the World events, this is a series of events. They're all available as recordings on the National Centre for Writing's website. So thank you very much.
You.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.
Nice to meet you all.